Hello there. My name is Dr. Scott Cormode. I am the Hugh Dupree Professor of Leadership Development at Fuller Seminary, and we're going to be talking today about 1st and 2nd Kings. First Kings starts out by talking about Solomon. David is dying, David dies, and then King Solomon comes along and he ascends to the throne. He asks for God for wisdom when he could ask for riches. God promises him, well, since you ask for wisdom, I'll give you wisdom, but I will also give you riches. But over time, what happens with Solomon is he becomes distracted by wealth and by comfort. He's told repeatedly that if you walk in my ways and if you stay on my path, then I will never take away the throne from your family. The problem is that he eventually turns from that. And he turns from that because he becomes distracted by his wealth and by his comfort. One of the themes that comes up in 1st and 2nd Kings is this idea of women. And once upon a time, what would happen throughout most of Christian history is that people would look at 1st and 2nd Kings and they would blame the women for what was going on. So, for example, it wasn't Solomon who had turned from the path. It was Solomon's wives who had lured him away. I want to suggest that is a misreading, not just of all of Scripture, but a misreading of 1st and 2nd Kings. And I want to point to a couple of different people that stories that play themselves out. Part of what happens is that the Elijah story is then mirrored in the Elisha story in a whole bunch of different ways. And one of them is the way in which they encountered women. In 1 Kings chapter 17, Elijah is on the run. He eventually ends up in Sidon, in a little village called Zarephath. And when he gets there, he encounters a woman. And he walks up to the woman and he says, give me water. Eventually, she feeds him. And as she feeds him, her resources do not run out. But then something terrible happens. The son dies. And she is bereft. And Elijah comes to her and says, no, I will provide for you. God will provide for you. I will raise this child. And he raises the child from the dead. In 2 Kings 4, Elisha now encounters a woman, and she is a widow, and she has no one to care for her. A creditor has come to take her 2 children away and say that because you owe me money, I will take your children and I will make them slaves. But what does Elisha do? He says, what do you have in the house? And it's a wonderful question because it starts with the question of, what do you have to bring? I'm not just going to care for you. I'm going to give you agency in being a part of whatever it is that God's going to do for you. And she says, well, all I have is one little jar of oil. So she contributes. And he says, okay, go to your neighbors and borrow from them whatever pots or vessels or receptacles that you can possibly find. Notice how the community becomes involved. It's not just that she is involved and not just God is involved, but she brings in the entire community. And they find as many vessels as they possibly can. And they go into a room, they start pouring out of this little jar until it fills up each of the vessels. And, it calls to mind, it's like the wedding of Cana meets the feeding of the 5,000. There's this sense of just overflowing sense of abundance that comes out of what was moments ago just this sense of scarcity. These are examples of hospitality, of community. And of course, when Jesus comes along, Jesus points to them as examples, both Elisha and Elijah, and the ways in which they dealt with these women. We have had historically a misunderstanding of how we read 1st and 2nd Kings if we take them to be about the women who excuse the faults and the sins of the men, that somehow the men are no longer complicit because the women actually were the problem. And instead what we find is, again, women as models for how God will provide for God's people and how they can be a part of their own tradition with caring for the community, caring for hospitality. 1st and 2nd Kings provides all sorts of really interesting examples of women if we would only look for them.